Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Efficacy versus Effectiveness podcast. If you missed part 1 last week, we suggest going back and listening to that, where we introduced the topics of efficacy and effectiveness, the differences in between them, and we also introduced an analogy that we refer back to throughout the show about a rickety ship. And in this week's episode, we continue that conversation and continue to talk about why it is important to have science backing what you do and why it's our duty as coaches to be sure that we're putting out the best information possible. We really enjoyed recording this one, so we hope you enjoy listening to it too.
What are our goals as trainers and as physical therapists when it comes to touching the lives of our clients or our patients?
Yeah, I think that's something important to remember with all of this is like why we got involved in this. And I think when you ask almost any personal trainer or physical therapist, they got involved to help people. And I think sometimes that gets lost in this, I don't know, maybe trap of trying to make money or trying to create something new or trying to maybe gain recognition or become one of those gurus or whatever. Sometimes we get kind of pushed off that main goal of helping people and we start to get sidetracked. So I think it's super important to remember that we got into this to help people. And in order to do that to the best of our ability, we need to make sure that we're constantly looking to get a little bit better each day so that we can serve the clients we have to the best of our abilities.
Yeah, I remember a very early realization I had when I was, out of school and in my first full-time job as a personal trainer, realizing that these people were in front of me with very real consequences if they didn't take action, whether that was not being able to participate in activities that were really important to them or literally having their long-term health threatened if they didn't make some pretty hefty changes to their lifestyles. I remember thinking that if I'm going to be partially responsible for their successes, I need to make sure that I'm doing everything that I can, or I'm as on top of all of the different tools that I could potentially have in my toolbox. Because if I missed one that could have helped somebody and they suffered a consequence as a result of that, then I wouldn't feel that I was doing my job to the best of my ability.
Coaches definitely have a probably larger impact on their clients than they realize. And as a therapist, I learned that because of my, my background in strength and conditioning and training, majority of my life, I've always dipped into both worlds, So when I actually became a physical therapist, it was natural for me to network with a lot of coaches, and then coaches started referring clients to me because they basically thought I would probably be a better physical therapist for their clients than if they just went to any old physical therapist. And it really started to amaze me, like how many clients would listen to their coaches over, say, their medical doctors. Their doctors would say, I want you to go to, the clinic downstairs, and their coach would say, you should go see Eric. And most of the time they would take the coach's advice and go see me, And when I started seeing that, I really realized how much clients look up to their coaches and really respect their opinions. So, going back to what we're talking about, responsibility, it does fall on us as coaches or therapists to make sure that we are being the best we can be. And that starts with trying to be less wrong and trying to be a little bit better every day. So yeah, that's just been my experience, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think coaches realize, especially new coaches, realize how much of an impact and influence they have on their client's life. Because if you really look at it big picture wise, these people spend more time with you as their coach than probably almost anyone in their life besides their partner and maybe some of their family and the people they work with. So you're in like a very small group, and the people they work with, they may or may not actually want to be there. So
that's true.
They're coming they're coming to you and spending like all their free time with you. Like, people don't have a lot of free time and they're choosing to spend it with you, and you become much more than just a coach in that aspect where, people look to you for all sorts of advice and look to you as a role model. And if you're not, again, doing your best to try and be a little bit better every day, you're going to let down a lot of people.
I think that a lot of trainers do take those steps to be a little bit better every day, but they end up falling into the trap of subscribing to one school of thought or one method. And so, again, our rickety ship analogy, this is probably the guy who hires somebody and doesn't necessarily take all the precautions to make sure that the ship is safe, right? Is that what you guys would say? That?
Yeah, I mean, it's much more easy to ride the wave of 3-letter acronym than to really question what they're doing and how it fits into your philosophies and your principles.
I think that people, I would give them the benefit of the doubt and say that a trainer that is seeking out a 3-letter acronym likely has the best of intentions, however misled they may be. Do you guys disagree?
No, I agree with that. We talked about before how a lot of people, particularly trainers, will say the research always falls behind, what we want to do. And I believe that they believe that, right? I think that what they mean by that is, there's this new thing that definitely works. It just hasn't been proven that it works yet, but I'm going to use it because I know it works. And then the intentions are there, So I do believe that most people have well intentions, even if I disagree with what they might be doing.
Overall, I think people in the field have good intentions, and sometimes does come back to maybe not, questioning themselves and being in a position to change their beliefs.
So does having good intentions negate the negative outcomes that they're creating? And I'll offer myself up first. I don't think so. I think even if you have fantastic intentions, if you're creating negative outcomes, no matter your intention, I don't think that that's acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to is ignorance acceptable? And, given the fact that you have put yourself out there as a coach and you've put yourself out there to help other people, automatically makes you responsible for what information you're putting out.
Yeah, and no one's gonna really always know, because I said that in physical therapy the stakes are a little bit higher, but they're still relatively low. This isn't life or death stuff we're talking about here, right? It's health and fitness and exercising and physical activity, and that's why there's not a strong governing body, because I'm sure, like an anesthesiologist, they can't just be like, well, this isn't shown in the research, but like I'm pretty sure it works. I know this guy that like teaches it, and he seems really smart, so I'm going to start giving this person this type of medication when they're under anesthesia. Like that would never work, right? Because that person could die, So yeah, I'm kind of with you there, Ryan. I don't think it's acceptable, but how do you fact check that? Because especially with the lack of the governing body, I mean, when we talk about 3-letter acronyms, most of them are they're just marketing things, right? Very few of those acronyms you earn. Like I have a physical therapy degree, so I went to school and I graduated with my DPT, and then I got a license. Those ones matter, because that's what allows me to be a physical therapist. But there's so many other letters that you can throw after the name, and you can just pay a bunch of money and throw those letters there. It doesn't necessarily mean anything because there's not anybody fact checking, and I think part of that's because the stakes are only so high.
Well, and I think a lot of that comes back to our schooling and education, and kind of being taught from this abnormal perspective, and always trying to find what's wrong with the person in front of us and kind of fix them, and not learning how to like train the whole person in front of us and kind of broaden our view and finding ways to connect with that person. And we learn about whatever internal and external rotation and how much hip internal and external rotation we need to do X exercise. But like people aren't their internal and external rotation. It's much more multifactorial and much more nuanced than that.
Well, what you're talking about, I'm going to butcher this word as well, is epistemologic responsibility. So
epistemological.
So I feel like I'm learning to read all over and over again. So, I mean, what we're really talking about is the active pursuit of information to either prove or disprove what your current beliefs or protocols are when you're dealing with your clients or your patients. And everything that we're doing is going to have an effect on another person's life. So we can't dial that search down to zero. We always have to be looking for new evidence to guide us in what we're doing.
Yeah, I've done a decent amount of teaching, as you guys know, and I can tell you that position, standing in front of a room of students, and you can say whatever you want, and they're going to write it down and take that word as, they're going to take it as correct, So even in that sense, it's almost like you're the guru for the day when you're presenting in front of a group of people that are, there to listen to you. So one of the things I wish I learned more in school, I guess, was how to think, for lack of a better word, because that's really what all this boils down to, right? It's not just taking somebody's word as gospel, taking things at face value, but really trying to be able to scrutinize it.
I think we really are sounding like those old guys, right? Because when you're a student, you just want the teacher that tells you what to do. You don't want the guy who makes you
exactly.
Yourself, right?
Exactly right. I think we're just getting old. We're just like bitching the whole time. Is that what this podcast is? And another thing.
That's what most of them turn into. So I think there's another part of this is kind of learning. Another thing that I kind of wished I learned in school was learning more about how we learn and how the human brain works and how we kind of problem solve. Because a study I saw that was super interesting was they gave these people a set of lights. They had to hit a certain sequence of lights to win a prize. And, people are just hitting random sequences. But as soon as they find one, and they get the prize, they just keep doing the same one over and over again. But what the researchers didn't tell them, that there was 20 solutions to the problem, and they found one solution and they just kept doing the same solution over and over again. But there might have been a more effective or more efficient or more time-saving solution that they just never even explored, because they found one that worked and they just kept doing the same one over and over again. And that's our bias. That's how our mind works. Our mind is inherently lazy. And once we find that solution, we're not going to search for a new solution unless we are actively trying to, and actively, questioning our beliefs and questioning if there are more solutions to the problem.
Completely turned my mind inwards, and now I'm just thinking about what I'm doing. And I'm like, shit, turning on the light the same way? I've never heard that analogy before.
That one hurts your brain.
Yeah. And I immediately also thought of clients who have experienced successes in the past, and they immediately revert back to whatever they were doing when they were losing weight. The most common example I can think of is somebody telling me that they lost a lot of weight when they were in school or whatever, and they would go to the gym for 2 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I'm like, well, can you do that now? Do you have the time to go to the gym like that frequently? And the answer was always no. Now they were married, now they had kids and a career. And it's like, okay, well, like, just because that turned the light on when you were in college, like, it's not going to be a successful solution now. So we have to look for other ones.
Yeah. So that pursuit needs to be intentional. It needs to be voluntary. There needs to be a willingness to self-examine and admit that you're wrong. You need to be aware of where you're getting your knowledge and the credibility of those sources, and looking for first-hand sources instead of second-hand sources. And then surrounding yourself with like-minded people. And when I say that, I don't mean people that agree with everything you say. I mean people that are also on that endless pursuit of bettering themselves and endless pursuit of knowledge, and preferably ones that disagree with you, so that you can have those tough conversations and start to find those common themes in what you all think works. And usually those common themes are the things that have been proven as efficacious and effective.
But yeah, I think that's a great point, that we want to surround ourselves with people that will challenge us, but also care about the same things that we do, and are also looking to, relentlessly better themselves in similar areas.
Yeah, I think Greg Lehman has a good analogy here. He talks about finding the active ingredient and looking at all these different things that people are doing and finding what's similar in all of the different interventions. And those are usually those things that you need to be focusing on.
That's what I always try to look at when I see somebody that get good results from something with little research to support it. It's like, well, what, I understand their rationale for why it might have worked, but what other reasons why it might have worked that they're not looking at? Is it that they're, spending this extra time with their client and they're really like selling it and they're hands-on with them and they're, just like driving that home, or is it just something else? But there's a lot of reasons why something could work besides the light switch thing, I guess, right? There's a lot of reasons why something could work besides the obvious one that people are assuming, especially with exercise. That's what makes exercise research so difficult, because when we talk about validity, we want to look at one singular thing and see if that one singular thing caused this outcome. But you really can't do that when you're having humans exercise, because there's always physiological and non-physiological factors that tie into the results. So you can't compare yoga to strength training and just say, well, strength training has more load than yoga does, so strength, that's why strength training has these results. That's part of it, but there's so many other factors that tie into it that you can't just isolate out one singular thing when you look at exercise research. And that's what makes it so complicated, So one study will come out that supports this, but when a whole shitload of study comes out and then that systematic review comes out and kind of contradicts that one study, that it's frustrating to say, well, I thought it worked, but it, I guess, doesn't work as good as I thought it did, or it doesn't work any better than any other thing that we would have done. I like that light switch idea, because that really resonates with a lot of, what I see when I think people misinterpret research or just kind of get their own confirmation bias for why, their whatever works where somebody else's might not.
Yeah, that can lead to some difficult conversations with clients too, where it's like, hey, we've been doing X and I think we might want to pivot to Y, and there are some reasons for that, and I'll share them with you if you want. But I think it shows growth as a professional if you're willing to leave something that you thought was maybe more effective or efficacious than it was, and really just being able to be like, hey, I was wrong.
Well, and I think, a big part of why this conversation is so important is the exercise science field is very young. I mean, science as a whole is relatively young in the grand scheme of things. And at the beginning, they were concentrated on studying things that were more life and death. And, they've just recently gotten around to studying exercise and pain and those types of topics. So we're looking at, a really young field, and that's constantly changing. And we have to admit that we're wrong on a pretty regular basis. And, I think that some of people's holdup in science is like, oh, they're always saying different things. And it's like, yeah, because, in the grand scheme of things, we don't know everything, and we're constantly learning new things. And science does have the tendency to prove things wrong more than it does have the tendency to prove things right or prove things that work. And it's like being able to look at science as a whole and support science as a whole, and not just, nitpick studies or maybe not use studies at all.
We're supposed to assume we're wrong until proven right, not the other way around, right? And that's what a lot of this stuff turns into.
So, yeah, looking at science as a whole and not just nitpicking studies. I think some of the other complaints that we hear are that studies don't happen in the real world. We kind of brushed on that, the fringes of that, this whole conversation. And another one is, that's not my population. I train elite athletes, or I'm an elite athlete, and that guy in that study only squatted 400 pounds and I squat 600 pounds. So that study doesn't apply to me. So what do you guys think about those complaints?
I think that we've talked about something similar on previous episodes. I don't remember the exact example, but just wherever you are on that performance spectrum, that the principles that make you perform better don't change as you increase your strength or whatever trait you're looking to improve. So there's you really like the nuance of your program changes. So regardless of how strong you are, your physiology is the same as it was.
The principles are still there, right?
Yeah, and your human physiology doesn't change if you squat 200 pounds or 600 pounds. you're still, the physiology is still the same.
Plus, it's hard to do research with a bunch of 600 plus pound squatters. There's just not that many of them. So if you kind of use that as an excuse, you're going to always be just kind of guessing more or less on, so you're never going to have a system that's going to help you kind of see that signal in the noise of your training. Like what are you responding to? So even if you kind of want to be a little bit more skeptical because the population in that study doesn't sound like you, that gets into effectiveness though, right? Is this generalizable to you? And it might be more than you think, because if we're talking about a particular study on something like squatting for improving strength, there is efficacy already established for that, right? We already know in a controlled setting that's a good way to get somebody to have somebody improve their squat. Let's have them squat. There's good efficacy for that. And then there is some effectiveness there to say that just because we don't have a ton of studies with 600 plus pound squatters, we're pretty sure we can generalize it to that population because the physiology is still the same. And there's just been enough literature in that area. So let's use that as our building blocks for your program instead of just saying, well, that research doesn't apply to me. I'm just going to do whatever instead.
Yeah. And I think, there are some studies out there on super high trained individuals, and we do see similar responses. It's just the magnitude of change that's different. Like, someone new to training might get a huge gains out of a certain intervention, whereas someone who is very advanced might get less gains, but they're still both getting gains from that intervention because that physiology is the same. So oftentimes it's just that magnitude of response that differs. And then we also see that people talk about age groups like, all the studies are done on college kids that are looking to make extra money. But, the studies that are done on middle-aged people and the few studies that are done on women, again, tend to show similar responses with just different magnitudes. So when we're looking at efficacy-based studies and starting there, and then that usually gives us a good groundwork, and those studies are more likely to prove, or those interventions are more likely to prove effective than ones that don't have any efficacy to begin with. When I'm designing a program and someone runs into a problem, say, let's use an example, let's say their bench press is stalling. I'm going to go to the research and look what has the most evidence, and that's going to be what my toolbox is made of. So I might see, something about manipulating volume or manipulating frequency and that having good effects. So that's might be where I start over, say, doing Bosu ball one-arm dumbbell bench presses, because there's no research there. So yeah, maybe we can find, people say that, oh, you can find a study to find anything. And yeah, maybe you can find a study to back you up, and there's might be one or two, but I want to find where there's the largest group of evidence and start there, because what science does is it finds what works works the best most of the time for the average person, right? So if we just assume that everyone that comes to us is average and work backwards from there, then we're going to waste way less time than doing it the other way around.
Yeah, one of the things that we do, and I think this is because we are so scientifically driven, I guess, is collect a lot of data on clients too. So we also can pull we have that building block off of the efficacy and effectiveness and knowing the literature. And then as we work with someone for months on months, we collect all this data on them. So when their bench press stalls, first of all, we're confident that we've been doing a solid program grounded in these principles, but then we can also look back on the previous data points and see what did that individual specifically seem to respond to best. And that could be slightly different than somebody else. And, that's where you start to get maybe a little bit away from being too scientific, because what worked for somebody might be a little bit different for somebody else, but it's still grounded in those principles.
Well, and I think that brings up another super important part that I think a lot of people miss when it comes to research is they'll see maybe something that has been shown to work over and over again, and they'll try it and it won't work for them. And they'll be like, oh, science doesn't work. This didn't work for me. But we got to remember that when we're looking at the conclusions of an experiment, those are the averages. There's always going to be some individual response to that intervention. And no matter how effective or efficacious intervention is, there's going to be a group of people that don't respond or maybe even respond negatively. There's going to be a group of people that respond well, and there's going to be a group of people that respond like astronomically. And knowing that, and knowing we might have to try different interventions to find what works for the person in front of us, again, comes back to that whole idea of coaching the person and not just looking at, their internal rotation or external rotation and making them their hip, looking at them as a person.
Right. And nothing is as simple as, black and white, yes and no. It's a spectrum. And so if somebody implements a protocol that they looked at the research for and it didn't happen to work out for them, rather than just dismiss it entirely, think if there are any possible reasons that it didn't work for you at that moment in time. Because I think as soon as we write something off, our likelihood of revisiting it in the future, it decreases significantly. But if you can come up with reasons why you think it might not have worked in that moment, rather than dismiss it completely, it might be a useful tool that can come back around when the circumstances are right.
Or even vice versa, why something worked that wasn't supposed to work, right? And I think people like things to be black and white. They like things to be yes or no. They want a specific answer. They want do this and do X and Y will happen. And it's not like that. That's not how training works. That's not how life works. Everything's on a spectrum. Everything has gray areas. And as every strength coach's favorite answer, it depends.
Yeah. I think of just this one kid I knew who loves running 5-3-1. He just tries anything else and doesn't make progress. He's like, I'm going to go back to 5-3-1. It's like, rather than think about why, like, what is he doing within 5-3-1 that's making it work? And at some point, I think we did touch on this earlier too, like the buy-in matters. If somebody is thrilled and hell-bent on one mode or method and you can't convince them otherwise, like, they're going to be successful with it because they're bought in and they're going to work hard.
That's the first question I ask when I comes down, because we're talking about all this science stuff, but when I talk to a client about a program, the first question I ask is, did you even like it? Let's start there. I know I got all this science stuff going on that we're talking about that got me to the program that I gave you, but did you like that?
Yeah, at the end of the day, our beliefs and expectations are going to shape our reality. I say it all the time. And that's part of the reason what makes all of this so muddy is that, there's always beliefs and expectations and social learning and confirmation bias and all these factors going on, even in a controlled experiment. So, there's noise no matter what. And our goal is to try and eliminate as much noise as possible and figure out what really works.
So we've been talking about the differences between efficacy and effectiveness, and ideally in a certain scenario we would have both, right? But there are sort of pros and cons to each one, right, Eric?
Yep.
So when you're looking at, can you give me like a specific example in the clinic where you might prefer one to the other?
Well, it's not so much a dichotomy of one or the other, but you ideally would have a little bit of both, but it goes back to the validity thing. So the efficacy being more cause and effect. So if I want to do something to reduce pain, it would be nice to know that this intervention does that. You just kind of found that signal and all the noise there. And so we need well-controlled studies to prove that there's efficacy there, but a lot of people might come in with similar complaints, and they're different ages, different genders, different everything, right? And so now we start to get into, will this be effective for anybody that presents with this? Can I use this intervention with anybody that presents with similar situation? So it's always sort of a going between the two of them. If I see a study that showed that a certain exercise was effective for shoulder pain in women over the age of 60 that have stiff shoulders, can I use that exercise with women in their 40s that just have painful shoulders that isn't stiff? Or can I use that in a 20-year-old male swimmer? That's where you start to get into more generalizable applications. So we're kind of constantly always doing that, because just so many different walks of life come through the clinic, and there's only so many really strong, efficacious types of interventions.
So I think that's a good point, is that, that it's not a dichotomy. It's, they simply ask different questions. Is efficacy-based trial is going to be best or going to be good to study a new intervention and see if it has the specific effect we think it has. And then, effectiveness trials are going to be able to better capture, the multifactorial nature of training and programming and inform us how treatments or interventions compare to the currently available interventions or standards of care. And I think it's important that, they're both there and there's those checks and balances.
So if there, like, hypothetically was a practice that you might be considering, you might find it to be effective, but it hasn't been proven yet, so its efficacy is in question, is that something that you might prescribe to your clients, or is that like a no-no in the physical therapy world? Does that ever happen?
It certainly happens a lot. And that starts to get into, which we touched on before, things that are trendy or possibly fads in physical therapy or even in strength and conditioning. So, if typically that probably comes up on the patient's end. So if they request something specifically, there has to be a little bit of give and take there, and those are case by case situations. But I kind of use this sort of 90-10 rule that I hear a lot about in nutrition, right? So if you follow a diet 100% of the time, you're going to get probably good results. If you follow that diet 90% of the time, you're also going to probably get similar results than if you had 100% compliance. So you don't need to be 100% perfect. So when I create training programs, or when I'm working with someone in a physical therapy setting and we have a certain amount of time allotted to do stuff, I sort of think of that 90-10 rule that I hear a lot about in nutrition, where as long as, the majority of what I'm doing is grounded in things that do have a bit of efficacy and effectiveness, if the other 10% improves my relationship with the patient or client, or improves the buy-in or adherence or compliance on the patient or client side, then maybe that we give a little bit there, at least initially, because we don't want to lose that individual as a client or as a patient. Now if they want that to be 90% of their treatment and I'm only going to get 10% to do the stuff that I think might be more helpful, then that might not be a good fit. Just in terms of, I might not be the best therapist for that person. And I've kind of reached a point in my career where sometimes I'm okay with that, I think. So does that kind of get into what you're asking, I think?
Yeah, and I think that's actually the second time you guys have kind of brought up that concept. The first time was when we were talking about a potential client in the gym who is used to doing something a certain way, and we're starting to show them new ways of doing things that might be more efficient. And my thought was just that, if people are coming to us, chances are their level of fitness probably isn't going to be phenomenal. So if we can give them that 90-10 example, 10% of the stuff they do, we know we could probably make it more efficient, but it's going to keep them bought in, and they're going to really start to trust us a little bit more if it's there, rather than right out of the gate, we beat them over the head with, no, that's not in the research, so you can't do it. I think they're going to be a lot more successful.
I also think it comes back to weighing the risks and benefits and doing an honest evaluation of what you're having your client do. And the 90-10 rule works perfectly. And here's, if you're spending 90% of the time doing things with high benefit and low risk, you're probably going to be doing good. But you do still want to make sure that if you're doing things that may not have the science behind them, that there isn't a lot of risk involved. So we may try some, respiratory drills that don't have any science behind them, because there's really no risk to doing them if the person's willing to. But we probably won't ever have someone squat on a BOSU ball, because the risk there is huge. So even if someone came to us and said, hey, I want to, squat on a BOSU ball, I'd ask them, are you in the circus? And if they told me no, I probably would have a conversation with them why that's not a great idea.
That actually circles back pretty nicely to the order of things that I think I touched on at the beginning, where the first thing we're supposed to ask is it safe? And the next thing would be, is there efficacy behind it? And then is it more effective than, what might be typically done? And then is this possibly effective in various populations? So if somebody comes back into you guys or to myself and they're requesting something that you might not normally do, you just loop back to that first thing. Is it safe? No. And then you're going to stop there, right? Squatting on a BOSU ball, the risk rewards is not there. And then you go, is there efficacy behind this? So let's say like some respiratory type drills, not really, no. So then you go, well, 90% of what we're doing is what I want to see. The 10% that they want to do, we'll probably still get really good outcomes. And, I'm just establishing some rapport with this person. So I think I'll concede that we can tie this in as a filler exercise with something else that I want to do, because it is safe. And then, maybe over time they'll say, yeah, I don't think I really need that. I'd rather, I'm going to give you the reins completely now. So I want you to do 100% and that 10% goes away. Or maybe they just really like it. And that's just something that, because everything else is going according to plan, you just kind of concede on that one. And that's how we kind of think grow as coaches and clinicians.
Yeah. Cause that client-clinician relationship or client-coach relationship is super important, and there is research that shows, the stronger that relationship is, the better results that person's going to see. So again, that circles back to looking at science as a whole and being able to apply it to what you're doing in a sense that is practical.
Yeah, and to sort of tie a nice bow on top of this, everything that we talked about was centered on looking at the research and determining whether it's applicable to our clients or our patients. So at the end of the day, we can make sure that we're not putting people on rickety ships and they're not going to be at the bottom of the ocean. Yeah,
no rickety ships, guys and girls. Make sure we're checking our ships and hiring inspectors and doing everything in our power to make sure the ship gets to the other side.
A lot of structural integrity in our yachts. Evan Reed's on the back. Thanks a bunch for listening, guys. Eric, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us, giving us your insight as to how a physical therapy professional looks at the research. And, like we said, there's probably slightly higher stakes there, so you have probably combing through research pretty frequently. As always, if you enjoyed us stumbling over our words and laughing at us, leave us a 5-star review. All of us on Instagram are _resilient and our first name. So Ryan _resilient, Eric _resilient, Paul _resilient, and resilienttraininglab.com.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Thanks for listening. Can't wait till next time.